recent reports have put the Minnesota Vikings on blast after this decision at the NFL draft to not draft the secondary position. We're going to be talking about this, what Kwesi's decision-making goes, and passing up guys like Malachi Starks and Nick Emenroy are very interesting decisions that the Vikings have made here at this draft. So we're going to be breaking it down, going over where some reports have us put in the rankings, and going over why the Vikings could have bettered themselves here in this draft. Very quickly, before we jump into it, be sure to hit the sub button if you haven't already. We know there's just over 70% of you guys watching right now are not subscribed to the channel. If you're looking for a spot for all of your Minnesota Vikings news this offseason, we have it right here. We have so much stuff still to cover from this draft and from so much more stuff coming out, you won't want to miss it. But Griffen, without any further ado, let's jump into this screenshot here from The Athletic, putting us at dead last in the Vikings draft rankings, or the NFL draft rankings, I should say, putting the Vikings at 32 and ranking, the players individually pretty decent. Normally you're like around like B to A minus, I believe, was the ranking scale that they had for the players. But as an overall draft for the Vikings, I think that this could have certainly been better. Now, Donovan Jackson, a phenomenal guard and one that I'm excited to see. However, I do personally think was a bit of a reach, but is a perfect fit for the Vikings. So I'm going to kind of jump into this a bit later as well when we get into the deeper parts of why some smarter moves could have been made. But at 32, I still don't think the Vikings did a horrible draft, and I think big part of 32nd ranking is due to the sheer lack of picks they had, and also not filling the secondary. I feel like that was kind of the headline to a lot of people who were not in tune with the Vikings, so it really does make sense at 32. But Griffen, overall, I know you've been pretty much making the videos during this draft and since the draft here, and I kind of got an idea of your opinion, but what do you think about a 32nd draft ranking for the Minnesota Vikings?
I think 32nd is a little bit too harsh, but like you said, maybe it was just because of the amount of volume of picks that we had and the amount of impact players that we took. You hear Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell talk about impact and that they were looking for impact players. We went out and got some guys that we feel are impact players, but apparently the rest of the NFL or the journalists don't think so on that matter. But with this Minnesota, there were so many things that they could have done with the draft because of guys that weren't taken as soon as we thought they were, or the Vikings didn't trade back to stack up more picks until later on in the draft. However, still, overall, I think it was still a pretty solid draft. I think it was also, too, that there was the expectation or the precedent that Kwesi's had on draft day where it's either making a ton of moves or making big splashy picks, whether it's Jordan Addison, JJ McCarthy, Dallas Turner, or things like that, where it kind of puts the NFL on notice a bit, where they're like, hey, Vikings make a lot of moves on draft day. They're known for making a lot of moves or making big picks. Now it's just expected that they're going to do that every year. It doesn't have to be like that every year. Sometimes you go with the quiet pick. You go with the pick that kind of matches your scheme the most and fills in the most gaps that you have on that depth chart. In the secondary, would have been nice for them to address things like that, especially in the safety as far as a successor for Harrison Smith after this season. I know we're going to touch on that in a second as far as the Malachi Stark stuff is concerned. But overall, I think this draft could have been a lot worse. It wasn't as bad as some other teams I felt. However, it could have definitely been a lot better. I'm still happy with what we got overall.
Yeah, and I like what you said about Kwesi there as well. Normally being that, big spender, I guess, in terms of going for the big picks, making the big trades and whatnot. But I still do think that this pick could have been traded in the first round. When we go and look at the remainder of the first round, Donovan Jackson, we had at 24. I feel like he was more of a second-day guy, round two guy, and I feel like Joseph Fainaya probably could have been a first-round guy. We had spoke about both of them. Donovan Jackson, not so much, but his name has been thrown out. I do feel like the Vikings wanted him. Of course, they wouldn't have picked him if they didn't, but going there and potentially not getting what they wanted in a trade in return to be able to move down to maybe round 2 and 3 from this first-round pick, and it can make sense. We're never going to know the full details, so we kind of got to take it with a grain of salt, maybe throw out what we think here, maybe throw out, what some people are saying, but with Donovan Jackson, I do think he's a very, very good offensive lineman. As I said, I think he's going to be an elite guard. We saw him play, I can't remember the exact amount of games at guard, but 9 at tackle at the end of the season with Ohio State, and he's going to be a very, very talented player. There's no doubt about that. So I'm excited to see him, but when you have guys there at 27, like Malachi Starks, when you have a guy like Nick Emenroy at the beginning of the second round, and knowing that our secondary was one thing that the Vikings seemingly needed to tackle and didn't really touch at all in this draft, this kind of concerns me a bit, especially with knowing Harrison Smith is going to be likely retiring. I don't want to say it's basically confirmed, but I think after last season with the kind of thought process that he had to go through to get to this point, it almost is nearly confirmed. You have a guy who in Donovan Jackson who will ultimately make a slot here in this immediately, but when we're looking at the guard class of next year, which we don't have in this video, but a lot of young, talented guards are going to be in free agency next year. I feel like Blake Brandel could have worked into this lineup in some way and really, just made it work. And I do feel there was a few things that could have been done, here and there to be able to change things up and just make it a little bit better, even with the picks they had. But I do understand the necessary need for guard. And when we're looking at the second round here as well, a big group of Nick Monroy, Quinshon Judkins, Trayvon Henderson, 2 running backs that we spoke about, both from Ohio State, Jonas Savaiinaia, the second round pick there from the Dolphins. Luther Burden, another one, a wide receiver that we'd spoken about. All 5 of these picks here, the Vikings have been linked to, and kind of go off the board and select someone that may or may not be ranked below these guys. So, Griffen, I want to know as well what you think. With the picks that were available afterwards, and I know that, we kind of discussed the possibility of the Vikings picking what they need more so than, kind of going for the biggest name. When you're looking at these names here, looking at the way that the Vikings picked, we knew running back wasn't an issue, but when you have Nick Monroy, when you have Malachi Starks, when you have even a guy like Jonas Savaiinaia, who is very, very good. I wouldn't say necessarily as good as Donovan Jackson, but when looking at these guys, do you think it was a reach? I know that, it's not as easy as kind of just say yes or no, but I want to know what you think about this.
Could have been a bit of one. Like you were saying, that I like what you said, where they might have been trying to trade into the second round so that they could not have to seem like they were reaching so much to still get their guy, but they couldn't make it happen. Maybe that was the case. But like we were saying before we started recording, is that when it happens in fantasy drafts all the time, that kind of when one person starts taking a quarterback or one person starts taking a receiver, or one team starts taking an offensive lineman, every team starts following suit because they don't want all the good ones to get picked up before they have a chance to get a crack at the bat. Minnesota definitely seems like that was the case here, where we saw a lot of offensive linemen go in this first round. It was a very offensive lineman heavy draft just throughout the rest of the rounds too. If you were watching how teams were kind of just trying to craft an offensive line, kind of stealing a book out of Philly, or page out of Philly's playbook, sorry, and trying to just have a bolsterous offensive line and worry about the other pieces in free agency or in trades. Now, the thing about that is that, like you were saying, the free agency pool for guard is a lot better than the free agency pool for safety would be next year. Is that the guarantee that those guys would all be available in free agency? Not necessarily, and that's a risk that you run in free agency. So I can understand Minnesota wanting to go with a sure thing in a draft pick in that. However, you still could have run the risk of not getting him in free agency for the same reason as a safety. You're going to lose Harrison Smith. You don't have a successor plan backed up unless you go and make a trade before the deadline this season. So there's a lot of things there where it's just going to be hard for Minnesota to have a backup plan or a future plan at safety afterwards, at least for a long time. It might be in the next draft, it might be in the draft after that, but they're still going to have a bit of a revolving door at safety until they can find that young talent that comes in. And Malachi Starks was one that I definitely thought Minnesota was going to go for, especially when they didn't trade back. They were able to pick before Miami, before Baltimore was, so they were able to kind of just have it set up perfectly where Malachi Starks is a Minnesota Viking as someone you can rotate at corner and at safety like Josh Metellus and be the backup plan to Harrison Smith. It seemed like the writing was on the wall. However, I can understand them also going the route of Donovan Jackson. Would I have liked them to have waited to try and get Savaiinaia? Maybe. But again, they weren't guaranteed to get that by the third round. So you got to kind of go and get the getting while it's good is basically what they did. And as well as we saw what happened last season when Cam Robinson had to come in for Christian Darrisaw. We saw when Brian O'Neill got hurt in the playoff game how our next guys up weren't exactly ready. And Blake Brandel didn't play terrible, but I can see Minnesota wanting to just have depth. And yes, in safety, we're one injury away from being decimated. However, on the offensive line, you still have Blake Brandel, who played solid, but if he gets hurt, then you're screwed as far as a backup spot there. Brandel was solid enough to play as a backup. So if you have these guys in there where you have guys like Will Fries, Ryan Kelly, Christian Darrisaw, Brian O'Neill, and you have guys that can back them up that are also reliable, that's probably why Minnesota went this route, especially when you want to protect the young quarterback.
Yeah, with the way they made this kind of free agency offensive line build, I think that they're trying to take, like you mentioned, that playbook of the Philadelphia Eagles, have an offensive line that is very similar, maybe change out one piece for years to come, play well together, and ultimately kind of build an offense around that. It does certainly seem like it when we go here to the offensive line. Christian Darrisaw, Donovan Jackson, Ryan Kelly, Will Fries, Brian O'Neill. Ryan Kelly being the oldest of them and still not even being that old, really. This is going to be a dangerous offensive line in years to come. There's no doubt about that, and I do love the Donovan Jackson pick, but I just think that, at least in my opinion, at least kind of looking from the outside, that there were some more important picks that could have been made. Because when we look at the safety here, I know, Harrison Smith, like I said, the uncertainty of his future will always be surrounding there. But then we also have, the possibility of Josh Metellus playing safety. Do we trust him every game there? I know he can play in just about every game, and I don't hate that idea as well. He's an absolute dog, but he's also a free agent after this season, which we saw what happened with Cam Bynum. Uncertainty there can really draw some very, very uneasy thoughts for Vikings fans when it does come down to it. But as Donovan Jackson's kind of comparison here and his pro comp in Isaac Samola, we're fine. We're fine on this. I do like the comparison here, and having him as the possibility of this elite guard, the elite offensive line for years to come, certainly makes me happy because the Vikings have never had that, it almost seems like, or at least not in past decades. So it's good to see, and as you see there, the post-draft analysis, cornerback and safety were both considered in round one for the Vikings, but they went another route, versatile offensive lineman in Jackson, and it makes sense with the additions they have, as you mentioned as well, the possibility of having him play tackle if there's an injury, the depth. It really just does make sense to have that offensive line locked down and go from there. So, do I think there were options for some, better drafting? Yes, but do I hate it? Not necessarily. So, I think that's the way a lot of Vikings fans are thinking about this, and 32 definitely is a bit harsh. There's no doubt about that when you have, Jackson Dart being drafted in the second round, when you have the Browns taking 2 quarterbacks, things just make no sense there. But, Griffen, you got anything else before we finish this one off here?
Yeah, I think what I saw on that last graphic is I think a lot of what we both forgot was Theo Jackson, I think, is the big reason why Minnesota ultimately didn't go and address the secondary, because this is a guy that we did not get to see last year in his rookie year. The Vikings have only seen him in training camp and in preseason. They are very high on this guy. So yes, while we may not have gotten Harrison Smith replacement valve for the future, we might already have that in Theo Jackson. It's just a matter of him being an unproven commodity and basically being a rookie this year, just like JJ McCarthy is. So it's almost like a second-year rookie in a sense. So I do understand the motive in that, and Kwesi even said that too, how high they are at Theo Jackson, how the depth was why they didn't go out and get a guy in the secondary. So again, I think that was something that we kind of overlooked that I wanted to touch on, because I do think that he will be very exciting to see, and I want to give him his props because he has definitely been earning that spot on that roster, been working his ass off, and I can't wait to see what he does this season, and hopefully he does prove that he is the future at safety after we move on from Harrison Smith.
Yeah, I sure hope so. And if there's any team that I trust bringing someone in, having them in a starting role right away, it's the Minnesota Vikings, this defense, Brian Flores. They teach well, they play well, they learn well, they all play well together. So I'm excited to see Theo Jackson as well. That's a good point as well. We didn't really mention that, but I'm very excited to see him as well. I think that he could be a very serious piece that a lot of people are overlooking here in this upcoming season. So let us know what you think about this draft in the comments below. Do you think 32 is fair? And the option are no, don't say yes, because it's not. That's not fair. But 32 definitely seems like a bit of a stretch there from the Athletic. But it's only time until we see come the NFL next season, as well as trades could possibly go down for one of these safeties. You never really know in the NFL offseason. That's all we got in this video. If you did enjoy, give it a like, hit the sub button as well. But we're signing out. Thank you for watching. Hope you have a great day. See you later.